Here we are, 2024, and nobody can get a job. Well, the good news is it's not completely your fault. Here's what companies are doing wrong during the interview process. Hey, if you're new to my channel, this is Patrick Recruiter. My name's Patrick. I have nearly a decade of experience growing teams from just a handful of employees to hundreds globally. Whether you're a job seeker or a recruiter, understanding where companies go wrong during the interview process will help you navigate the interviews or improve upon your hiring process. Let's dive into the major mistakes that companies make. First up, a lot of times companies might post a role without actually having a clear understanding of what they're looking for. They might post a role without actually knowing why they need this role, who is the ideal candidate, and what the candidate will be working on. I know this sounds crazy, but sometimes companies just post roles to get the flow of candidates coming and applying to their roles. When companies do this, oftentimes they're trying to figure it out during the actual interview process by interviewing candidates, then determining this is the scope of the position. This is all wrong. As a job seeker, if you're applying to one of these roles and you're being interviewed by a company that doesn't really understand what they're looking for in a candidate or what the candidate is going to do once hired, it's a complete waste of your time. Hopefully you can flag this up front with detailed questions during the interview process. That way you can dive into what is actually expected in the role. If they can't answer that question or answer questions around what does success look like in this position, 1 year, 2 year, maybe even 3 years down the line, that's a major red flag. This lack of clarity not only wastes your time, but the company's time as well. And anybody that's interviewing or any recruiter out there, if you're working on roles like this, you need to firm up the process to save your candidates time and effort. When companies aren't clear about what they want, this just becomes a fishing expedition. Every interview that happens is just purely about how do we figure out who is the ideal candidate profile and what do we need in this role for it to be successful. Chances are this also ties into compensation. They don't have an idea what they're really looking for. Chances are they have no idea how to pay for it and how much to pay for it. Dig into compensation early. I know it's a touchy subject and some people don't like to handle it right away, but you as a candidate, you should be digging into compensation early on to determine, does this company actually have the proper scope of the role and also the proper compensation to go along with that scope that meets your needs as well. It's pretty simple. If there's no budget, chances are they're lacking clarity around the role. The second mistake that companies are making during the interview process is simple. The process itself is too long. From the initial application to getting a recruiter screen to getting that hiring manager scheduled for an interview, then team interviews, then a final round interview, and then maybe reference checks, then finally an offer. It takes forever. This process needs to be better. Companies should be paring down interviews to 4 or 5 interviews max, and then also be able to move the candidates through the funnel quickly. You as a job seeker out there, if you're actively interviewing and the company's moving along pretty quickly, let's say they have a recruiter screen, they get you scheduled for a hiring manager interview the next day or so, and then all of a sudden team interviews after that, and then a complete stall, it's a huge red flag. And chances are you're probably not the top candidate and you should be looking elsewhere. If you're a company out there right now keeping candidates warm, you're only doing yourself a disservice. These candidates are going to go elsewhere, and chances are you'll lose out on a high quality new hire. If you've been interviewing the last year, I guarantee you probably face this problem. This is the third thing that companies get wrong during the interview process. This one's an absolute killer. It's when interviewers come in unprepared for an interview, or sometimes they don't even show up for an interview. That's a waste of the company's time and the candidate's time that's interviewing. You wouldn't believe how often I talk to candidates and they're scheduled for an interview only to have either nobody show up or get a message 2 to 3 minutes prior to the interview that it's canceled, and it just ruins everything. The reputation of that company is out the window. Even probably what's worse than that though is when an interviewer shows up and actually has no idea why they're interviewing for the role or what's expected of them during the process. Candidates pick up on that. I'm sure you've been in that situation where you're getting questions from the interviewer that have nothing to do with the role or your experience, or it's pretty clear that the interviewer never looked at your resume or your LinkedIn profile prior to the interview to come in prepared with questions. It's super confusing and a complete waste of time. As a company, prepare your interviewers in advance of the role and why they're interviewing, what their role is, and what is expected of them. As a candidate interviewing, if you get the sense that things just don't seem right, you're not getting questions that seem relevant to the role, this is another red flag that you got to be aware of during the interview process. And the fourth thing that companies get wrong during the interview process is just poor communication, particularly around feedback. Companies out there, if you're not providing feedback to candidates that you've interviewed for the role, especially if they're a couple stages into the interview process and probably have already met with the hiring manager or even potentially the team that they would be joining, and you provide no feedback or very generic feedback, that is a horrible interview process, and you gotta firm that up. You do this by actually being super transparent to the candidate that you're speaking with. Treat them with respect and come up with actual reasons as to why they weren't selected for the role. They can handle hearing that feedback and then using that feedback elsewhere. If you're a job seeker, chances are, you know, when you apply to a role, you're probably not going to hear back from that position unless you're moving forward to the next step of the interview process, which would be a recruiter screen. Once you speak to a recruiter, it's expected that you're going to hear back. If you don't hear anything back, chances are they might have ghosted you, or the company is just really poor at delivering bad news, which is another red flag. As a candidate interviewing, if you feel like you're being ghosted, be sure to follow up with that recruiter or hiring manager that you interviewed with 2 to 3 days after your interview to get that feedback. That way you know where you stand in the process. And the fifth thing that companies are getting wrong in the interview process is by posting these ghost jobs that are out there. Those are those roles that companies post to not actually fill immediately. They could be posting a role that is an evergreen position that they're always kind of hiring for and pipelining candidates into. That way they have a fresh set of candidates when they are looking to hire. Or they're just posting roles to look better for their current employees. That way the current employees think that the company is doing well and they're growing. This is sending such a bad message to any candidate that's applying to the role. If you are a company and you're going to post a pipelining type of position, you can simply put it in the job description at the top. This is a pipelining position. We are looking to hire 2 to 3 months down the line. At least candidates applying to that role can be aware of that and set their expectations appropriately. However, if you're just posting ghost roles with no actual intention of filling the role, candidates are going to become aware of that when the role is open for months or gets reposted every couple of weeks to make it look like a fresh role. If you're a job seeker out there and you see a role that's been open for several months, or it's one of those roles that keeps on getting reposted every couple of weeks, chances are that's a ghost job. Don't apply to it and focus on other new positions. If you're curious about why companies ghost you, I did a deep dive video, which I'll include at the end. For the companies out there that are actively trying to create an awesome candidate experience, define for your team why we need this role, what the purpose is, what the ideal candidate profile looks like, who's on the interview team, what their responsibilities are, what the compensation is, and how quickly are we looking to make a hire. If you can define all those prior to posting a role, all the job seekers out there are going to be thankful for it. If you're able to create an awesome interview experience, you're going to get awesome candidates because of it. As a job seeker out there, be aware when you're interviewing. If the company that you're interviewing with doesn't seem to have a full scope at the position, that's one red flag. If the interviewers come in unprepared, that's another red flag. If the recruiter can't give you any information around the compensation for the role, that's a third red flag. If you're interviewing for a role and then all of a sudden the process just stops and you're left in the dark, that's a fourth red flag. And then finally, be on the lookout for those roles that might be ghost roles where the company's not actually looking to hire. If you found this video helpful, you might like my other video where I dive into why companies ghost candidates during the interview process and what you can do about it. Like, subscribe, and follow for more career, interviewing, and recruiting insights.